Imagine being trapped in a city surrounded on all sides by your enemies, cut off from the land, with your only lifeline a narrow stretch of water. Your food is running out, the cold is setting in, and you face the terrifying realization that your once mighty army is slowly being starved into submission. This was the grim reality faced by British troops during the Siege of Boston, a moment that would forever change the course of history. How did a small group of colonial militias manage to trap an empire's army? What daring moves did George Washington orchestrate to turn the tide in favor of the Revolution? And what mistakes did the British commanders make that sealed their fate? This is the Siege of Boston, a story of endurance, strategy, and determination of a people fighting for their freedom. Stay with us as we uncover the brilliant tactics, the fierce skirmishes, and the turning points that shaped the fate of a young nation. Chapter 1. Seeds of Rebellion. Long before the first shots were fired in the American Revolutionary War, tensions between the American colonies and the British Empire had been simmering. The British government, facing debts from previous wars, imposed taxes and duties on the colonies, who in turn were infuriated by their lack of representation in British Parliament. The famous Boston Tea Party in 1773 was the tipping point. In retaliation, the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, punishing Boston by closing its harbor and sending over 4,000 British troops to occupy the city. But rather than pacifying the region, these actions only fanned the flames of rebellion. In secret, local militias began to form, stockpiling weapons and organizing under the banner of resistance. The colonists had had enough. Tensions escalated, and on April 19, 1775, the British, under orders to seize military supplies in the town of Concord, found themselves confronted by colonial militias at Lexington. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the official start of the American Revolution. Chapter 2. The siege begins, a city under siege. Following the clashes at Lexington and Concord, thousands of colonial militia members poured into the area around Boston. They quickly established a siege line that stretched from Chelsea to Roxbury, effectively surrounding the British forces on three sides. The only remaining lifeline for the British was a harbor, which allowed them to receive supplies and reinforcements from the Royal Navy. General William Howe, now the commander of the British forces in Boston, realized that his position was becoming increasingly precarious. The colonial forces, under the loose leadership of William Heath and later General Artemas Ward, grew in strength and numbers with each passing day. Militiamen from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut joined the Massachusetts forces, forming a united front against the British occupiers. The colonists blocked all land access to Boston, trapping the British in a city that was beginning to run out of food and supplies. General Howe and his men were forced to rely on the harbor for resupply, but even that wasn't enough. The British soon found themselves cut off from fresh meat, firewood, and other essential resources. Chapter 3. The Battle of Bunker Hill, a costly victory. By June 1775, the British were growing desperate to break the siege. General Howe devised a plan to seize the high ground on the Charlestown Peninsula, particularly Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, from which the colonists could bombard the city. But the colonists were one step ahead. On the night of June 16th, Colonel William Prescott led 1,200 men to fortify Breed's Hill, just a short distance from Boston. When the British awoke the next morning, they were shocked to see the colonial earthworks towering over the city. General Howe, now under immense pressure to act, launched a full-scale assault on the fortified positions. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be known, was one of the bloodiest battles of the early war. The British made 3 separate assaults on the hill, and while they ultimately took the high ground, it came at a staggering cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, including 92 officers. The colonists, although forced to retreat, had proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with a professional British army. The Battle of Bunker Hill may have been a tactical victory for the British, but it was a psychological victory for the colonists. The British army had taken Hill, but their heavy losses showed that the war would not be won easily. The long winter of 1775, starvation and stalemate. As winter set in, the Siege of Boston entered a grueling phase of endurance. The British, trapped in the city, were running dangerously low on supplies. Firewood was scarce, and soldiers resorted to tearing down wooden buildings, including the historic Old North Meeting House, to keep warm. Hunger and disease began to take their toll, with smallpox and scurvy spreading through the British ranks. Washington, now officially in command of the Continental Army, faced his own challenges. His army was poorly equipped and low on gunpowder, with many soldiers being issued spears in place of rifles. Washington knew that he needed to break the stalemate, but an all-out assault on Boston seemed too risky, especially as the freezing weather made any large-scale operations difficult. But while the city remained under siege, a brilliant plan was being set in motion, one that would turn the tide of the war in the Patriots' favor. The Knox Expedition, the journey for heavy artillery. In November 1775, Washington dispatched Henry Knox, a bookseller turned military commander, on a daring mission to retrieve heavy artillery from Fort Ticonderoga, nearly 300 miles away. Knox's expedition was no small feat. He and his men braved freezing temperatures, icy rivers, and treacherous terrain to transport 60 tons of cannons and mortars on sledges pulled by oxen. By January 1776, after an arduous journey, Knox and his team had successfully delivered the artillery to Washington's army. The arrival of these cannons would prove to be a game-changer. Dorchester Heights, the turning point of the siege. With the newly acquired artillery in hand, Washington devised a bold plan. On the night of March 2, 1776, under the cover of darkness, American troops fortified Dorchester Heights, a strategic hill overlooking Boston and its harbor. Using timber and prefabricated defenses, they constructed formidable fortifications in just one night. When the British awoke the next morning, they were stunned. General Howe, realizing that the colonial cannons now had the range to bombard his fleet and the city itself, knew that his position was untenable. He reportedly exclaimed, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months." Howe quickly formulated a plan to attack Dorchester Heights and dislodge the colonial forces, but a sudden storm thwarted his efforts. With no other option, Howe decided to evacuate Boston. The evacuation of Boston, a victory without bloodshed. On March 17, 1776, after nearly a year of siege, the British Army began its evacuation of Boston. More than 11,000 people, including British soldiers, loyalists, women, and children, boarded ships bound for Nova Scotia. As the British fleet sailed away, the American forces reclaimed Boston without a single shot being fired. The siege of Boston had come to an end, and for the first time in the Revolutionary War, the colonists had won a decisive victory. It was a moment that bolstered the morale of the revolutionaries and showed the world that the American colonies could stand against the might of the British Empire. The legacy of the Siege of Boston. The Siege of Boston was more than just the first major military victory of the American Revolution. It was a symbol of the ingenuity, perseverance, and determination of the Patriots. From the harrowing Battle of Bunker Hill to Henry Knox's daring artillery expedition, the Siege of Boston demonstrated that the colonists were willing to endure great hardships in their fight for independence. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and the Siege of Boston was just the beginning. The American colonies were now united in their struggle for freedom, and the war for independence would only grow fiercer in the years to come. If you enjoyed this journey through history, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories from the past. And as always, stay curious.